Hi everyone, my name is Lynn Key, and today I'm going to be presenting our paper called Investigating Deceptive Design in GDPR's Legitimate Interest. I worked on this paper with Sushil Shivakumar, Roesner, Cristiana Santos, Frederike Zufall, and Biega. So perhaps you've seen this before, especially if you're in the EU or the UK. Basically, if you're configuring your consent choices on a consent notice, you might come across this legitimate interest thing. So if you've seen it, you're definitely not alone. Legitimate interest is something that's being more recently talked about, as seen through some viral Reddit and Twitter posts. So this begs the question, what is this legitimate interest thing, and why should we care about it? Legitimate interest is one of the 6 legal grounds for processing data under the GDPR. It refers to processing of data that's necessary for the purposes of a legitimate interest that are pursued by the controller or by a third party. So this means that if a data controller, meaning advertisers, service providers, etc., believe that they have a legitimate interest for a certain purpose, they can conduct a balancing test, often without any oversight, to see if they can apply this legal basis to their data collection purposes. And legitimate interest is meant to account for data collection purposes that are not foreseen by the GDPR, and also to avoid an over-reliance on consent and other legal grounds, hence its importance. Therefore, it's a very broad and very flexible legal ground. However, legal scholars have also noted that there's a potential for abuse. Ideally, it should not be used as a loophole to avoid consent, nor should it be a preferred legal ground. And so this is what our paper investigates. We want to investigate and identify how legitimate interests are being used in practice through privacy notices, also called consent notices, cookie banners, etc. And we identify the corresponding deceptive designs that are being used, and we discuss the legal implications of these deceptive elements. Additionally, we also investigated how users evaluate these deceptive legitimate interest practices. So in this first study, we conducted a privacy notice web crawl. In this, by crawling 10,000 top sites and conducting a qualitative analysis, we identified how legitimate interests are being used in practice. I also identified the deceptive designs that are being used corresponding to these legitimate interest practices, and also the legality of these practices. So I'll go over the ways that legitimate interests are being used in practice. Overall, we found that there's a lack of transparency when it comes to disclosing legitimate interests. So of the 10,000 sites we crawled, only 4.7% of them actually mention this in their privacy notices. This is very low, as presumably many more sites are relying on this legal ground without telling users. And of these 474 sites, 13.7 of them don't actually specify what their legitimate interest purposes are. And we also found that 31% of privacy notices rely on both legitimate interest and consent for collecting for the same data collection purposes. Overall, we also find that IAB Europe's transparency and consent framework, which is this by industry for industry kind of solution for applying the GDPR and consent notices in practice, the TCF has major impacts on how legitimate interests are being applied in practice. So all the sites that we found mentioning legitimate interest in their privacy notice were adopting the TCF, which was declared to be illegal due to some problematic elements. We also find that deceptive practices are much more prevalent when legitimate interests are applied in privacy notices. And this is most likely due to the less enforcement and attention that's paid to legitimate interests compared to consent. Overall, we conclude that most practices relating to legitimate interests are illegal under the law, and this may also be intentional. We believe that due to the evidence that we found, legitimate interests might be purposefully designed in a way that discourages user interaction, and therefore websites can use this for their own business purposes. So 3 major elements that we found relating to legitimate interests are first, advertising. Personalized advertising was often commonly used, despite it being, it cannot always be used as an advertising purpose. Secondly, there's also this difficulty of opting out. So while consent requires an opt-in approach, if users want to consent to a specific data collection purpose, oftentimes legitimate interest requires an opt-out approach. And often this is by the vendor and or purpose level. And this is a lot more tiring for users as they have to go through multiple options and opt out of each of these. Another element that we found that was very problematic is this reliance on both legitimate interest and consent for collecting data. This is problematic because you cannot rely on various grounds for the same data collection purposes, and nor can you use legitimate interest as a backup if users don't consent. In our second study, we conducted a 4-part survey with 399 participants from the EU and the UK. Here, we identified how users understand the term legitimate interest, and also what users think is reasonable for companies to collect under this legal basis. So when it comes to user perceptions, we find that not surprisingly, not all legitimate interest purposes are accepted by users equally. Users are most accepting from a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being very comfortable. Users are most accepting of security and debugging purposes and fraud and law enforcement purposes. However, they were least accepting of personalized ads purposes, and this is in line with previous research showing that users are very skeptical of personalized ads data collection in general. And we were also interested in potential future legitimate interest purposes. These three purposes are very commonly used in practice, and we wanted to see if they could be counted as legitimate interests to reduce consent fatigue based on how users evaluate them. And here we find that users are fine with functional and strictly necessary purposes, like they're very comfortable sharing data with these, and therefore this could be a legitimate interest purpose in the future. However, users are not very fond of sharing data with third parties, and therefore we recommend that this not be used as a legitimate interest purpose in the future. And overall, we find that users are very suspicious of data collection purposes and practices. So when they were asked to select under which toggle configuration they think their data is being collected, most believe that their data is being collected if at least one toggle is selected. And we even had a good group of people who believe that their data is being collected when no toggles are selected either. Here, we ran a multiple regression to see which factors impacted user acceptance, meaning how comfortable users are with sharing data for specific purposes. And we found that user acceptance of a legitimate interest purpose is most impacted by who users believe the data will benefit. And demographics played no factor in this finding. So if a purpose was deemed to benefit the user, society, and other users more, they were more accepting of giving data for this purpose. However, if a purpose was deemed to benefit service providers and third-party vendors more, they were less accepting of this purpose. So overall, we find that legitimate interests are being exploited through deceptive practices at various levels, and that these deceptive practices may also be intentional. Therefore, we foresee many potential GDPR enforcement opportunities due to the many problematic cases that we identified in our study. We also find that neither participants nor the law approve of advertising purposes under the legitimate interest legal basis, despite its very common usage. And when it comes to users, we find that users are generally not very aware of which legal basis their data is being collected on, who is collecting this data, or whom it benefits. And therefore, users should have a bigger role in data protection discussions. Here, we also listed some privacy by design recommendations relating to legitimate interest. So first is that there should be much fewer options when it comes to these choices. Currently, we find that a lot of the choices when it comes to legitimate interest are very granular, where users have to object by purpose and or by vendor. So here, we recommend that there should be an object all button for legitimate interest, or at the very least, present fewer choices to prevent overwhelming users. And additionally, when it comes to describing legitimate interests in privacy notices, there should be much more user-friendly and neutral language to prevent swaying or influencing users. And yeah, this concludes the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. And I've also put down my contact information if anyone wants to get in contact. And yes, thank you so much again.